Have you ever had a conversation with someone about an important subject and you feel like you're on the back foot? You know that you're on the side of truth, but for some reason you can't seem to find the right words to communicate your position effectively. And the person that you're talking to seems to really know their stuff. Maybe there's someone who studies law, someone who loves philosophy, or maybe it's just someone who just really loves a good debate. And at the end of the discussion you think, oh, if only I knew how to answer those questions. In the last session, we looked at how to make a simple case for the humanity and personhood of the unborn child. In this session, we're going to take it a step further. We're going to look at some of the tougher analogies that are used by those who have been taught to advocate for abortion, and we'll look at the best ways that we can respond to those. The three specific areas we're going to be looking at are the following. Are the unborn really as valuable as pro-lifers say they are? What about bodily autonomy? Should the rights of the unborn trump the rights of the woman? Isn't abortion a matter of personal preference? In other words, I don't personally agree with abortion, but I can't force my opinion on other people. We'll work through each of these topics and I'll share with you some of the best ways that you can use persuasive narratives to illustrate your point. So as we begin, I'd like to share with you an encounter I had with a biology student on a university campus in Florida. At this point, I'd had lots of conversations and I thought I'd come across most of the tough analogies, but this one really stumped me, forgive the pun, and it went something like this. Do you sit under acorns for shade? No. And just as crushing an acorn isn't a tragedy, but chopping down an oak tree is, aborting a fetus isn't a tragedy, but killing a person is. In other words, just as an acorn isn't an oak tree, a fetus isn't a person. This is one of those times that I was like, I couldn't seem to find the right words to say what I wanted to say. So before we even look at how to respond, let's take a step back and ask ourselves the question, what is she communicating that she isn't verbalizing? This student was placing value on oak trees because of what they give us: wood, beauty, shade. And she claimed that chopping down an oak tree would be a tragedy because they have specific functions and characteristics that we value. However, if you were to crush an acorn, would that be a tragedy? Not really, because they don't give us much. But can this way of thinking be applied to human beings? No, because if a human at some point in their life starts lacking specific functions, do they cease to be persons and do they cease to have value? So what we're seeing here is a difference between two models of human dignity: intrinsic dignity and extrinsic dignity. Intrinsic dignity means you have dignity simply because of what you are, a human being. It is being human that gives you value. Dignity is inherent. Extrinsic dignity means you have dignity because of what you do, a human doing. Your dignity is dependent on the circumstances in which you find yourself and whether others see you as having dignity. Dignity is conferred and can be taken away. But when it comes to human rights, our rights are based on our humanity, not our ability. But when we look at the arguments of those who advocate for abortion, we hear this ring of our rights should be based on our ability. And if you start lacking certain abilities, you don't have dignity, and therefore your life isn't so valuable. Let's just look at this one quote from Anne Furedi, who is the CEO of the British Pregnancy Advisory Service. I too believe that from the time an egg is fertilised, that a human life is there, and that unique life is wonderful and is marvellous. But the point for me is, it's really about who makes the decision about how that life is valued, not in the abstract, but in relation to other things. We really need to highlight to people that if they truly agree with human rights, then our rights must be based on our humanity, not our ability. Because when we look at human rights violations and genocides, they always begin when people start redefining our value and where our value comes from and how our value is perceived by others, instead of basing it on our humanity. We need to make that very clear to people. So let's look back at the analogy that this girl gave to me. So let's look at the best way I could have responded to this student. And it starts by asking questions. We could ask, is an acorn of the oak family? Yes. Is a fetus of the human family? Yes. Why isn't an acorn as developed as an oak tree? Because less time has passed, it's younger. Why isn't a fetus as developed as an adult? Because less time's passed, it's younger. Just because someone doesn't function in a specific way due to a lower level of development doesn't mean that that being doesn't exist within that species. No. An acorn has the potential to become a larger oak tree, but it doesn't have the potential to be an oak of the oak family. It already is an oak. A fetus has the potential to become a larger adult, but it doesn't have the potential to be a human because it already is a human. So we can start having this conversation about if it's human, shouldn't it have human rights, and we're led back down the track of what are the unborn. On another occasion, I remember an email exchange I had with a student who was talking to some university friends and peers, and she asked me this question. Because an embryo can split into two up to several days after fertilization, even shortly after implantation, forming identical twins, surely it follows that human life doesn't begin until after the point at which twinning can occur, as this is where the lives of two individuals can begin. When faced with these kind of tough questions, it's useful to use analogies to respond to them. So can you think of an example, a rare example, where one organism has the ability to split into two? Let's take, for instance, the flatworm. If a flatworm is cut in half, each half will regenerate into two separate fully functioning flatworms. Prior to this separation, did the flatworm exist? Yes. So in the case of identical twins, just because in rare instances a human being has the ability to split into two, doesn't mean that the one human being didn't exist before that split. No, and the beginning of that human life was at fertilization. Now, I remember talking about abortion with a friend of mine at the dinner table, and she was studying at Cambridge University, and she has an incredible mind, and she asked me this question. Imagine there is a burning building. In one room there's a baby, and in the other there is a petri dish of embryos. You only have time to save either the petri dish of embryos or the baby. Who do you save? When people come up with these kinds of analogies, we need to ask ourselves the question, what is she communicating that she isn't verbalizing? What she was saying is, you as a pro-lifer actually don't value the unborn in the same way that you value those of us who are born, and I'm going to prove it to you. And she gave this analogy. So how could we respond to her? So we could either make a statement in our response, or we could put forward an analogy. So let's imagine the same scenario again, and let's say in this case, you have an 80-year-old in one room and a newborn in the other room. The building's burning, you can only save one. Who do you choose to save? The baby, probably, but does that mean that the 80-year-old isn't a human being with value? Or let's say if you had your sister in one room and a room full of strangers in the other room, and you could only save one, who would you choose to save? Probably your sister. Does it mean that because we bond with one person in one way, that the value and dignity of other human beings is different? So actually what we're hearing again is this difference between intrinsic and extrinsic dignity. The reality is that all of us have unique value that's inherent because we're human beings. But how we value other people might change, but their right to life can't be based on how I perceive their value. So when you respond to something like the petri dish of embryos and the baby, just remember, use analogies. And actually, to make that situation truly analogous with abortion, you wouldn't simply run out of the building with the baby, you'd smash up the petri dish of embryos on the way out. Moving on to our last point on this subject, some abortion advocates want to take it a step further and say, okay, so you're against abortion, you must be against contraception as well, because isn't that ending a potential life? It's important to point out that there is a massive difference between preventing sperm and egg from uniting and ending a life that has already started. But the answer is, it really depends on the type of contraception. Anything that has the capacity to end an already established life from the moment of fertilization would be wrong. There is a massive difference between barrier methods like the condom and hormone-related contraceptives that have the capacity in them to thin the lining of the womb and prevent a fertilized egg from implanting if it has become fertilized. Now, some of you might say, hang on, contraceptions aren't abortifacient, aren't they simply preventing a pregnancy? This is where language is so important. The current medical definition of conception is the process of becoming pregnant involving fertilization or implantation or both. And contraception means to prevent conception, which is the whole process of fertilization to implantation. This definition brings with it far greater implications that we need to be aware of. As to how often embryos are lost is unknown, but what we would say to people who would wish to use hormone-related contraceptives is err on the side of caution, and it's useful to use an analogy to illustrate that. So let's imagine that you're a construction worker working on a site and you decide to take your child to work with you. And the job of the day is to demolish a building. And you're there with your child, you're about to demolish the building, but then you realise, oh, you haven't seen your daughter in a while. And in fact, there could be a chance that she's inside the building. Do you go and blow up the building anyway and think, oh, we'll just do it anyway? Or do you err on the side of caution, check it out and make sure she's not inside first? You'd err on the side of caution. In the same way, if hormone-related contraceptives have the capacity to end the life of a child in the womb, shouldn't we err on the side of caution? So we really recommend looking really at what are the type of contraceptives that are being used or that individuals wish to use, and just make sure that they don't have the capacity in them to thin the lining of the womb, so that if an egg does fertilize, it would die and not be able to implant. So in this section, we're going to be looking at more detail into human rights and what happens when there's conflict between two people's rights. For example, the woman's right to choose versus the baby's right to life. There's two kinds of human rights: alienable and inalienable human rights. Alienable rights are external rights and are based on our abilities. These are given from an outside source, for example, the right to drive at 18, the right to fly a plane, the right to drink at 18. These rights can change and should be given fairly to all and only withdrawn for the good of many. Inalienable rights are rights that can't be taken away and are based on your humanity, not your ability. These three rights, life, liberty and property, are all inalienable rights. So what happens when two inalienable rights come into conflict? For example, property and liberty. Let's take, for example, slavery. The slave owner's right to property and the slave's right to liberty. Well, in these kinds of situations, there's a hierarchy of rights. Liberty comes before property when there is conflict, and in order to have liberty, you must first have life. So of course, the right to life takes precedent above all other rights. So when two rights come into conflict, you go with the more fundamental right. So how does this relate to abortion? What happens when a woman's right to choose comes into conflict with the unborn child's right to life? It goes back to the hierarchy of rights, but it's useful for us to again use an analogy to make our point. And this one involves a professional fencer. Let's imagine there is a world-famous fencer who is practicing for a tournament, and he is in the training ring practicing his skills. We would all agree that he has total liberty to practice in the ring because he can choose what he wants to do with his body in that situation. He's got liberty to do that. But now let's say you've got the same fencer and he's now in a room full of school children and he decides to take out his sword and practice his fencing. Can he do that? No, why not? Because his right to choose what he does with his body stops when it infringes on a child's right to life. And the same goes for abortion. A woman's right to choose what she does with her body stops when it infringes on an unborn child's right to life. Now, in 1971, abortion supporter Judith Jarvis Thompson came up with an analogy to suggest that even if the unborn child does have the right to life, they don't have the right to use their mother's body without her consent. This specifically relates to the notion of bodily autonomy, and the analogy is known as unstringing the violinist. And it goes something like this. Imagine you woke up one morning to find yourself in a hospital plugged into a stranger, and that stranger is a world-famous violinist. You woke up to find yourself hooked up to this violinist, and you find out that the Society for Music Lovers kidnapped you, and they tell you that the violinist was going to die and your body type was the only one that would keep him alive. But don't worry, it's just for 9 months. She makes the point that just as you should have the right to unplug the violinist from your body, so too a mother should have the right to unplug the fetus from her body. She makes the point that even if the unborn child has the right to life, it does not have the right to use the mother's body without her consent. So how would you respond to this? Firstly, in order to make this truly analogous with abortion, you wouldn't simply unplug a violinist. You would decapitate, dismember and disembowel them as well. Secondly, actions have consequences, and if we consent to certain actions, we must accept the consequences for them. Secondly, whilst you had nothing to do with being plugged into the violinist, most babies are conceived via consensual sex, and if we consent to actions, we must accept the consequences for them. So we can use an analogy to illustrate that. If I had a child and we were playing ball in the garden, and the ball accidentally went through my neighbour's window, telling my neighbour, I'm really sorry it went through the window, but I'm not paying for it to be fixed because I only consented to playing the game, not the ball going through the window, wouldn't be right. Why? Because actions have consequences and we must accept responsibility for our actions. But then Judith takes it a step further and says, well, what if you haven't consented to the actions? What if the woman has been raped? Even in this situation, parents have a responsibility to their children that they don't have to strangers. While these responsibilities don't include parents having to do extraordinary things like taking their children to Disneyland, they do require them to do ordinary things like feeding, nurturing and sheltering their children. Therefore, maintaining a pregnancy is simply doing for the unborn what parents must already do for their born children. Now, a friend of mine, Stephanie Gray, was in a debating situation where a professor put forward another situation, and he said, okay, imagine having a child with a case of kidney failure and their parent is the only match. He said, although it would be nice for a parent to give their kidney, the law shouldn't force them to give a part of their body to keep their child alive. So how do we respond to this? The first question to ask is, what is the nature and purpose of the kidney versus the nature and purpose of the uterus? The kidney exists in my body for my body. The uterus exists around another body for that body, and it prepares itself every month in anticipation for another body. I can survive without my uterus, but my unborn child cannot. Therefore, the uterus exists more for that child. The purpose and function is more for a child than it is for me. This is why the law shouldn't require you to actually take out a part of your body and give it to your offspring, but should require you to nurture, care for, and look after your own offspring in the natural environment that was created for it. So let's reiterate those points. Abortion isn't unplugging someone, but intentionally decapitates, dismembers, and disembowels them. When we consent to actions, we must accept the consequences. Parents have a responsibility to their children that they don't have to strangers, and the nature and purpose of the uterus is to facilitate the growth and development of an unborn child. Another difficult question that arises is, well, what if the mother's life's in danger and she needs an abortion in order to survive? Whose right comes first, the mother or the child? Now, if we've already established in our conversation that the unborn are human beings and that their life is equal to those of us who are born, then we're talking about two human beings with equal dignity and worth. It's not a matter of putting one life above the other life, but it's looking at the situation and saying, how can we protect both lives? When the mother's life's in danger, that is an entirely different situation, and it's not actually referred to as an abortion. An abortion is the direct and intentional killing of an innocent human being, and therefore abortion would always be wrong. Now, in situations like an ectopic pregnancy where the baby implants inside the fallopian tube, the tube will expand and burst, killing both the baby and in some instances the mother, then what doctors need to do is a life-saving procedure. The intent is to save life. They need to remove the part of the body that could kill the mother. And if there was a way to incubate that baby and to help them to grow and develop, then we would. But because we don't have the scientific technology to do that, we can't. But the intent is always, how do we save them both? That is not an abortion. If it's a situation where, let's say, the mother has ovarian cancer or some other medical condition, doctors can intervene and do what they can to save life, even if it means giving life-saving treatment. And if that adversely affects the baby in the womb, that's not the intent again. The intent is to save life. And that really is the distinction that we need to draw. Abortion direct and intentionally kills an innocent human being. In these situations, a life-saving procedure needs to take place. Over 1,000 doctors signed the Dublin Declaration, which states that abortion is never medically necessary to save a mother's life. It is a myth. It may be medically necessary to deliver the child, but never to intentionally kill the child. Now moving on to the final topic. Isn't abortion a matter of personal preference? Have you ever heard anyone say, if you don't like abortion, don't have one? In other words, abortion might be wrong for you, but it's not wrong for me. I want to address this notion of objective and subjective claims for you. And to start, I want to give you a little analogy. So my sister has become rather experimental with her cooking. In fact, my whole family has started this crazy nutritious diet thing, cutting out gluten and dairy. And my sister has mastered the art of the gluten-free cake. In fact, I'm going to make this claim for you. My sister makes the best gluten-free cake in the world. Is that claim true? I hear some of you say, well, it's true for you. Yes, it's true for me. I think my sister's cake is the best. You might think yours is the best. They are equally valid claims. It's a matter of personal preference. It's subjective. I'm the subject, and that's my opinion. Now, what about this kind of claim? What if I said, my sister's gluten-free cake is the cure to cancer? Who would say that that claim's true? You'd all say absolutely not. So with that kind of claim, it's no longer a matter of opinion. It's either right or wrong, true or false. It's objective, and it concerns the objects in question, the cake, and its relationship to the disease. Objective claims are truths that exist independently of the subject. They are truths that we discover rather than we create. Now, our culture gets really confused when it comes to objective and subjective claims and abortion. They think abortion is a matter of personal preference, like me thinking that my sister's cake is the best. However, if the unborn are human beings, whether abortion is right or wrong isn't a subjective claim, it's an objective claim. It's either right or wrong. Saying if you don't like abortion, don't have one would be similar to saying if you don't like slavery, don't own a slave. Or if you don't like wife abuse, don't beat your wife. We need to help our culture see that if the unborn are human beings, then abortion isn't a matter of personal preference. It is a lethal choice. The unborn are human. Fact. Therefore, abortion is wrong. So how do we respond to someone that says, okay, I'm against abortion, but I can't force my opinion on other people? It's again useful to use an analogy. Let's imagine that I have a bowl of sweets, different colours. So we've got pink, we've got blue. Let's imagine that your favourite colour is pink and mine is the blue. Would it be wrong of you to force me to eat the pink ones because they're your favourite? Yes. It's a matter of personal preference, that would be wrong. However, let's say that some of the sweets are poisoned. You know they are poisoned, and I'm about to go and feed them to some children. Would it be wrong of you to tell me not to give them to the children? No. But isn't that you forcing your opinion on me? No, because we have moved between choosing which sweets we want to eat to whether it's okay or not to kill someone. One is a matter of personal preference, the other is a lethal act. In the same way, because abortion intentionally ends the life of an innocent human being, it's no longer a matter of personal preference, it's a lethal choice. And we have an obligation to tell people about that choice so that other children aren't killed. So to conclude this session, we've looked at, are the unborn really as valuable as pro-lifers think they are? We have discovered that regardless of our feelings towards some humans, the value and dignity of humans doesn't change. It's inherent. We've looked at what about bodily autonomy? Should the rights of the unborn trump the rights of women? We've looked at the hierarchy of human rights and discovered that when two rights are in conflict, the fundamental right takes precedent. In this case, the right to choose stops when it infringes upon someone else's right to life. And finally, is an abortion a matter of personal preference? We've shown that if abortion intentionally kills an innocent human being, it is not a matter of personal preference like choosing your favourite colour sweet, but a lethal choice which is objectively wrong. When we have these kinds of discussions with people, we must not be seeking to win an argument at the cost of losing a person. We must seek to understand, not just be understood. I've taken you through lots of scenarios where you can use stories and powerful narratives to make people look at abortion from a different perspective. Your aim isn't to change people's minds, but to challenge how they think, to leave a pebble in their shoe. Sometimes you spend a long time talking to someone and it seems like none of your analogies are getting through or your questions. In those situations, take a step back and ask yourself the question, what are they communicating to me that they're not verbalizing? What do I need to understand about them? Look at the person that you're communicating to and see what do they need to hear right now. That way you will be able to communicate with their heart as well as their mind and understand why they think, not just what they think. From what we have learned today, we need to help our culture see past these far-reaching analogies to the person at the center of this issue. We need to help them see that every human being, regardless of size, level of development, environment, dependency, has intrinsic dignity and worth, and their lives should be protected just as yours and mine should.